From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters.
It's the best plan in the entire country. People are touting our plan in every single province. Stephen Lecce, the minister, has done an incredible job with the support of the advice of some of the best pediatricians in the world.
Schools across Canada are getting ready to reopen in a few weeks. It's almost business as usual. Every province has a slightly different plan. Some are getting students to mask up, some are reducing class sizes, but none of the provinces are closing their schools during the pandemic. Every premier says the health and safety of students is what's most important.
I'm confident that everyone in the school system will do their utmost to follow the comprehensive public health guidance that Alberta Health has developed for schools.
As we begin the restart of our economy, that we focus on the most precious assets we as British Columbians have, our children.
The last few months have shown us both the importance of in-class learning and how creative, resilient, and determined Manitobans are.
As the Minister of Education, I can assure you that our government values the education of every child in this province.
What does it mean to send millions of young people back into indoor spaces for hours at a time? Will students be able to physically distance? Could the outbreaks we're seeing in schools in the US and Israel happen here? And do we know what the toll on their mental health will be? Parents, public health officials, and mental health professionals are all asking those questions. Today, we're talking to Dr. Tyler Black, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at the University of British Columbia. We're talking about schools in a once-in-a-generation crisis, what kinds of pressures students are under, and what we're going to call the gray area in the often black and white debate of to reopen or to not reopen. Dr. Black, thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Black, can you first explain the kind of work that you do in emergency psychiatry? What kinds of cases do you treat, especially in young people and in students?
We have a really unique program at the hospital I work in Vancouver, where instead of being child and adolescent psychiatry just in a general population or just being on call, we've actually specialized in psychiatric emergencies. So I've been the medical director of a unit that's admitted about 400 kids per year in psychiatric crisis. And then we see about 1,200 to 1,600 more in the emergency department. So in my career, I always say that I've summed up almost 10,000 kids in crisis. And the types of things I see are some of the things you might expect: stress and distress leading to suicidal thinking or suicide attempts. Also anxiety disorders, significant psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which are fortunately a little bit more rare in children. Depression, anxiety being much more common. And then a lot of neurodiversity. So about 25% of our population are kids with neurodiversity in crisis. So I see a wide variety of kids, but the common thread is they're all in psychiatric crisis.
And you wrote a Twitter thread about the mental health of students, and it went viral. I saw in the comments and the replies, there were a lot of parents who replied and retweeted you, public health professionals, and people in healthcare as well. Were you surprised your thread seems to have hit a nerve or that it's resonating with so many people?
I was, because the way that discourse often happens, especially in the pandemic, has been very black and white. And I always see one of my goals is to introduce nuance into black and white thinking. And I do this all the time professionally. When parent wants X and child wants Y, my job is to find the nuance between the two, not side with one or the other, which only creates further problems. And so when I created this tweet thread about the nuance of mental health as it relates to schools, I was expecting it to get some pickup, but it really did seem to resonate, especially with people who struggled in schools. We have this new rose-colored tint to in-person schooling, as if for the last 2 decades we haven't been talking significantly about structural, child-related mental health problems in our schools. And so the conversation just magically, due to the pandemic, became very black and white. Send to schools equals better for children's mental health. Stay home equals bad. But of course, there's many kids who flourished outside of school and some kids who've really struggled without the structure of school. And so there's nuance. And so when I interjected that nuance, I was obviously so happy to see it picked up on. But I was a little bit surprised because I kind of assumed that a lot of people had kind of picked their camp and wouldn't want to see the gray zone in between.
And almost in a social media discourse, I mean, usually things are really black and white. People are separated by camps. So it's nice to see nuance being appreciated, that people want to be part of that conversation in social media, which is, as we know, all too rare.
Yeah. And I often found that people who had official credentials, and these are people that I sometimes very much respect, they would almost concede the mental health point without ever having talked to a mental health expert. So you have tremendous emergency doctors and virologists and epidemiologists, and then they're talking about the spread of the virus. And then when a politician or a media personality interjects, but kids have to return for their mental health, they didn't have that psychiatric nuance to recognize what we see every day. My job is easier during summer and non-school days because kids are less in crisis. I see less kids. And my primary research interest being suicide, we know for certain that the highest rates of suicide are during school months and school days for kids. And so that nuance has just left the building. And so seeing that black and whiteness just be conceded by professionals is really what had me feeling quite compelled to say something and try and get it out there.
That schools themselves are a source of stress. They are difficult places for a lot of students.
Absolutely. And I often whenever I'm talking to families, I make an analogy that school is like a child's full-time job. They have their boss, the teacher, and the principal, their boss's boss. They have homework, which is work that they have to do. It's overtime work that they have to do after they've done their day job. They have their coworkers who are just approximate to them. They're just sitting next to them. They're not selected. They're just the people in the same office. And then they have their friends within that group. They also have friends outside that group. And then they have extra work activities that they have to do. So if we look at school like a full-time job, we recognize that some people love their job and some people find their job very stressful. At points, our jobs become overwhelming and we can't handle them and we need to take a break. And in other areas, our job becomes something very rewarding and fulfilling that we love to do. I personally love my job as a psychiatrist. So our jobs are stressful. And when schools add stress, it's not intentional. Sometimes it is, but it's not always intentional. It's because schools are naturally stressful. It's their child's full-time occupation. During a pandemic, people are going to be more fearful, more distressed, and they're going to be worried about their friends and family more. They're going to be picking up on the climate of fear that's there. And they're going to be holding that on top of their regular school stresses. So, of course, schools can be amazing places for kids. But again, I always want to just bring this cold, hard reality. The kids are more likely to die of suicide on school days than non-school days. And that always has to be in the back of our mind, that schools are stressful.
And I wanted to talk about mental health, especially in the context of school reopenings, that, Canada's provinces all have different back to school plans. Where you are in BC, there's sort of a stage plan. Here in Ontario, there are some mask policies that they're going to hire new nurses, but they're not reducing class sizes. But by and large, this conversation about schools reopening is that they are fully reopening in September to varying degrees. From that mental health angle, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it's unfortunate because it seems to be, I understand why people want to return to normal, because this has been a very stressful time that we've all suffered under. However, if we just removed COVID from our environment and we thought about the types of things that parents and educators might be advocating for, and we just magically took 2020 out of the picture, it would be things like smaller class sizes and more teachers and more educational options for children and greater support for children with mental health illnesses and neurodiversity. It would be ending bullying. It would be ending systemic racism. It would be systemically addressing poverty in kids. And so now that we've introduced COVID into the environment, all of a sudden those requests seem to have faded and the priority of that seems to have faded, and yet it's still there. So the BC approach being phased makes more sense to me, because the other concept that I still think is not landing well is the idea that the virus will dictate what we do. In BC, we're seeing a new spike of cases in Vancouver and Fraser. And if that spike continues, our schools will not be reopening in September. It just won't happen. We can policy it all we want in August, but the virus will also dictate what happens. And so if we know for sure that when kids get together, there's going to be sniffles and flus and sneezes and coughs, what are those going to do to those schools? They're going to shut them down. They're going to send them home on quarantine. And so there's going to be increased stresses during those times. Kids are going to be more worried. What's happening? Am I okay? Is this coronavirus? That nuance, again, just seems to have been subtracted. Though I think Canada has done it much better overall than our American colleagues, where it seems to be very much just open the schools. I think Canada might have gotten a little bit better, but I'd still like to see it more granular and responsive.
I mean, I was wondering about that too. Is this sort of a social experiment that we are all figuring out in real time? Because what does that do to a student knowing that they're going to school every day, knowing that there's a deadly virus spreading around, on top of the stress that they already normally have? That's an extra burden. I mean, we're all feeling it, but knowing that you're going into indoor classrooms for hours at a time, that has to be part of the additional mental stress that kids are going to feel.
Absolutely. The cold and the normal flu and all the other viruses that infect children haven't gone away. So we know for sure that when kids get back, there's going to be fevers, there's going to be sneezes, there's going to be coughs, there's going to be kids who get very respiratory symptoms sick. And that's going to, obviously in the age of corona, that's going to require everybody to be quarantined and tested and all those things. And that will cause the stress. I do think that we can rest a little bit on the knowledge that kids themselves are less likely to get extremely sick or die, but that it's not 0%, and certainly not in their parents, teachers, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and other extended relatives. And so I always think about the unlikely, but will certainly happen case in which a classmate's friend or family member or father or grandfather dies of COVID. That's going to be a stressful time as well. So all of these things will happen regardless of our policy. And so we want to account for them. It makes me wonder, is our curriculum as light as it needs to be? Is it super heavy and loading up kids with more stress? Because we know for sure there's going to be extra stresses in this environment. So a lot of the policies have to do with what the structure of school looks like. But I'd like to see more of an emphasis on, can we pare back that curriculum to the bare minimums to just relieve as much stress on kids as we can during this very trying time?
In your clinical experience, I've found it interesting that you've written about how, especially when there are other stresses going on in a child's life, that schools should actually take a back seat, that their health and their safety and their mental state is really what comes first. Can you talk about that a bit?
It's so easy to conceptualize when you imagine a child getting cancer. As soon as a child gets cancer, we focus on their treatment, their comfort. We want them to enjoy their life and be as stress-free as possible. We want them to get all the treatments they need to get and stay safe and healthy. When they're undergoing chemotherapy, they shouldn't go to school so that they don't get colds and viruses. And we accept that because we know that kids will catch up. When they return to school, when their health is better, they'll go back to school and everything will be okay. And a lot of my job day to day is asking school counselors and school principals, hey, can you forgive these next few weeks of homework as this child is struggling with the distress? We can always make school a relative priority, but it must rank underneath safety, security, and health. And so it's not a bad thing for us to say, let's make school the bare minimum for this year. 2020 is a wash. Let's reduce the admission criteria of universities so that students don't feel so much pressure to get Calculus 12 done during a pandemic. Calculus can be taught in university too. So these ideas become so rigid when we just assume they have to happen in person schooling in high school. They don't. You can learn these things through a number of modalities.
So you're saying that we should really be rethinking education during this time in the ways that we are rethinking how we city plan, how we do infrastructure. It's the same thing you're saying when it comes to education, especially in the middle of a pandemic?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Class sizes have always been too large. I always make this point over and over. This argument about class size has been going on for decades. And now we have another reason to reduce class sizes. It's not safe when there's pandemics. Probably some virologists knew that, but the public discourse has never included that, and now it can. In the same way, we know that schools have stress. It's not well known that kids are more likely to die of suicide during school months and school days, but it should be. It should definitely be a constant thing on educators' brains that we introduce stress to children. We should be working really hard to reduce the impact of stress we have on children. Our rigid requirements for attendance, our rigid requirements for how much homework they have, our punishing of not getting homework done, even though you and I both know we've occasionally missed deadlines for really important reasons. Schools can do a lot more to reduce the distress they inflict on children.
For parents, too, this is something that they're thinking about. They're facing a lot of stress, and perhaps why many are in favor of schools reopening at a certain point, too. We've heard from parents about how difficult it is to do their own jobs and balance their careers while at the same time looking after their kids at home. I'm sure, the Zoom meetings with people yelling in the background, that really starts to wear. What kind of mental stress are parents facing here? Because it seems like they almost have to choose here. It's either having their kids at home or potentially have their kids in an environment where they could be infected.
It's tough because the initial economic response from the government really allowed people more flexibility than they've had in the past. But of course, those things are going to expire. They're not long-term feasible. And families, particularly and disproportionately women in families, have been made into workers plus full-time teachers, and it's become quite a burden. So I definitely see a lot more parental stress, and we need to account for that. There has to be better ways than kids go to school to have good childcare for all parents and families. There has to be better ways for underprivileged students getting food during school to feed underprivileged students. They don't have to require in-person education. And so one of the common replies to my Twitter thread was this notion that a lot of kids get their lunches and their security from going to school, their access to technology at school. And of course that matters, and I would never want to take that away. On the other hand, it kind of indicates that as a society, we've offloaded this problem of kids being underprivileged and not having access to food and technology to schools, which are only open 10 months a year, which aren't open during the weekends and on holidays and Christmas breaks. So, we could more substantially support those things if we truly cared about it as a society.
Right. That's a sign of how teachers and the education system, for decades now, they've taken on more responsibility than just teaching. They are part parent, they are part mentor, they are so many other things in a child's life than just a place where they learn calculus or biology.
And what a wonderful thing for teachers who have that new capacity to be able to do all those things. But putting that as the sole responsibility of the classroom teacher, we've been hearing from teachers' unions and teacher advocates for decades that it's an overwhelming burden, that they're underpaid, under-resourced, understaffed. They're taking on too many kids, and they've been constantly asking for more resource. And one of the ways we could help them is by offloading the burden on schools. And that has to be a societal decision that we make, but it's one that we skip over if we just assume, well, yeah, they'll get that at school. That quick jump to, oh, we'll feed the underprivileged kids at school really neglects that societal knowledge that we don't really take care of the impoverished kids in BC very well. We don't take care of Indigenous children in BC as well as we could, or in Canada. So we have this knowledge societally, and then we offshoot it to schools as if that's the fix.
So really what you're saying is, and the point of the thread, the point of so much of what you've been talking about is that this isn't a black and white issue. It's not just a question of should we reopen, should we not reopen. What you're saying is that it's a time to really rethink how we do this, depending maybe on the province, depending on the COVID caseload, and thinking about how we can best do this for the mental health too. We can't just think about physical health, but it's also about mental health.
I think we can really see a lot of changes that may be a little bit more permanent because of this pandemic. I think there might be a lot of new work opportunities for work via teleconference because of how much we've had to use teleconference during the pandemic. And I wonder if this is the death of the handshake. It may be the death of the handshake. I'm not sure the handshake will survive.
I'm doing the elbow tap now too.
You don't know how this will pan out. Do we need the handshake? Is that a convention that we really need, knowing now that it could spread viruses? And we've known that it could spread influenza and other viruses for decades. But there's opportunities for us as a society to reconfigure things in a better way, not just simply go back to the way things were. Racism, systemic exclusion, bullying, bad teaching environments, poor class sizes, these all existed before the pandemic, and we don't have to return to those things.
Dr. Black, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me.
That's Dr. Tyler Black, child and adolescent psychiatrist at the University of British Columbia, talking about schools reopening in a few short weeks and the questions we should be asking about the mental health impact for students and kids when they do go back. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.